The next innovator I'm going to talk to is Mike Biddle, who is the president and founder of MBA, those are just your initials, aren't they? Yeah. Yes, Polymers. What you've come up with is this clever way of recycling things that were previously basically too difficult to recycle. So what's the sort of origin story in your case? I believe you started also at a big company and then left it to pursue your idea. How did that happen?
Well, I did. I was working for a big chemical company that sold plastics, and they hired me actually to work on high-tech plastics for aerospace. I was working on the stealth bomber at the time.
Is there plastic in the stealth bomber?
Yeah, there is. It's part of what makes it stealth.
And you're allowed to tell us that. Okay,
that's
good,
all I can tell you. I don't want to have to kill you afterwards, so sorry. So after about a year of working on that, it became clear to me that a bigger problem that the company faced long-term was to figure out how to reuse its materials. And I tried to convince management of that, and they thought I was nuts. In fact, I'll never forget the line my R&D director told me: "We didn't hire a PhD in polymer science to work on garbage." And, I convinced him differently 6 months later, but they let me research it, but wouldn't let me turn it into a business. So I actually had to leave in order to turn it into a business.
And what's the key idea at the center of your business? And again, there are proprietary trade secrets and so on. But what's the basic idea?
Well, I think the fundamental idea is, first, can you do it? I mean, you have to believe that it's possible. And first, let me back up just a little bit. The reason the large chemical company didn't want to do it was because it was cannibalizing their existing business.
So they're selling the raw materials for which you make plastic.
Yeah, and
so the fact that you
might
might
kind of like to see it go away and make more with the existing plants. And unfortunately, that's the mentality of many companies today: is let's make more the way we're making it today, and hopefully the stuff we made goes away quickly so we can make more of this and sell more of this. You know, we're trying to change that. We're trying to reuse the materials instead and resources. And so that was the fundamental problem. It was just, so I think that was the key idea, is that no, it's a good thing. And as Michael Dell says, cannibalize your own business before somebody else does. And they didn't get it then. And I guess we were both right, because that was 17 years ago. So it took me 17 years to turn it into a real multinational business. So it was just a little bit of idea before its time. But that company and many others in that space are now running as fast as they can to recreate their businesses to be more sustainable.
So why is it that recycling plastic is hard? We have some idea of this as consumers, because some places make you sort it and they make you look at those funny numbers on the bottom. Is it a type 4? Is it I don't know what it is, just put it in the trash. I mean, that's what ends up happening. Why is this hard? Why do you need to do this sorting?
No, that's the second part of the question. So first is you have to believe it's a good business to be into, and once you get past that.
Assuming that we are on board sort of that the idea problem is worth doing.
Exactly.
Why is it hard?
And it is very difficult, and it's the reason it's the last major material category to be reused. All other materials in the world, metals, even paper and glass, are recycled at very high rates, but not plastic. And it's not because plastic's not valuable. It's actually much more valuable than steel, for example. And steel's from automobiles, durable goods, electronics, and so forth, is recycled at over 90%. Plastics are less than 5%. But plastics are more valuable.
So why is it hard?
So it's hard. Yeah, I'm sorry to keep beating around the bush, but I want to put it in perspective. It's hard because the plastics are very similar to one another. So if you look at how you separate metals, for example, they're very different in density, they're very different in color, they're different in electrical properties. If I put a pile of metals in front of us, most of us could separate copper from steel, from aluminum, particularly if I gave you a magnet and a few other tools. If I put a pile of plastics in front of us, I have a PhD in plastics, I can't separate them. I can't tell one plastic from another. Their specific weights are about the same. Their colors can be any color, can be any plastic. Their electrical properties are more or less the same. So we had to come up with a new separation techniques. We had to find out what the fundamental differences between the plastics were at a molecular level, and how that expresses itself on a macro level, and then exploit that to force the plastics to separate. And that's the fundamental thing we discovered, besides trying to figure out how to separate all the rest of the non-plastics from the plastics, but to get the individual plastics, types, and grades to separate. That was
so basically you're taking the waste in and you're shredding it first, aren't you? Yeah. So how small are the pieces that you're then doing this separation process on?
They're about 6 to 8 millimeters, about the size of your small fingernail by the time. And that, I think that was that's when they really thought I was nuts, when I said, no, we need to separate it at a very small level.
You're shredding cars and things now, aren't you?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Cars, computers, refrigerators. Actually, other people shred those for the metals. We take their waste, the stuff that they're either burning or at a high cost, high incineration costs or landfill costs. We take that off their hands. Sometimes they pay us to take it off their hands. And then we mine out the plastics from their waste.
So you're mining it from this right, so you're mining plastic out of waste.
Above ground mining, yeah, it's a pretty good business.
And what are you able to set? So basically you're using some various techniques to distinguish between these different types of plastic, and then you can recycle all of them, or can you only turn some of them back into virgin plastic?
It's like an 80-20 rule. So there's literally hundreds of types and grades of plastics, but the majority are a handful of plastics. 80% of the plastics are about 5 or 6 plastics used in durable goods, and different grades of those. We focus on those because separating 1% of any material out of a large stream in any separation process isn't normally economically viable. So we get the low-hanging fruit first.
Right.
And year after year, we pick off another one from the mix.
And you've just picked off rubber, I believe.
We just picked off rubber. That was a big one. That was a difficult one to figure out how to separate from plastics and isolate by itself. But now we're recycling rubber right here in a plant in northern England.
Well, I was going to ask you about that because you just opened this massive plant here.
Yep.
You also have a huge plant in China.
Yep.
Tell us about, you've figured out the rationale for this. You've got the technology to work. Tell us about actually scaling it and making it work out in the world, because that's a different set of skills.
Absolutely.
The management and the execution from the innovation. So how did that all work out?
Well, I was listening to John's frustration. Would he be differently? And I think that's my biggest single frustration is here we are, an American-born company, and I'm building plants everywhere in the world except America. We still have our headquarters and pilot plant in America, but I'm putting plants. This is our second one in Europe, and as you said, we have one in China. And the next one we'll probably build. The next few we'll probably build are in Asia and in Europe before we'll build one in North America, although I'm working very hard on putting one in North America.
So why is that? Why is there less enthusiasm for actually doing this?
Well,
because places like San Francisco are really big on recycling.
Exactly, and we're based in the San Francisco Bay Area, so it's incredibly frustrating. And I have a lot of people saying, let's do it, let's do it, let's do it. The fundamental problem is it's much like technology. I think you'll understand the analogy quite well, where they say getting technology to your home, it's the last mile that's the most expensive. Getting fiber optics to every single home, that's the most expensive part of getting technology out to us. Well, in recycling, it's just the opposite. It's the first mile. So getting the stuff out of your houses, out of our households, is the most expensive part of the equation. Once that part of the equation is solved, the rest takes care of itself. The economic forces take over, competitive forces take over.
So it's the lack of enthusiasm for the basic recycling collections.
It's not just enthusiasm, because I think, as you point out, the enthusiasm is there in many parts, particularly on the West Coast, I have to say, not just because I live on the West Coast. But it takes more than just enthusiasm to get the scale that you need to pay for these massive plants I have to build to make them economically viable. So what Europe and Asia have figured out, that it makes sense to develop organized collection infrastructures for end-of-life products so that they can be collected in an organized and economically viable fashion. Once those are collected, they go to recyclers who like myself, the metal recyclers and us plastics recyclers, can now harvest those materials economically.
I'm just having trouble with this because Britain is a small country the size of a US state, and somehow we have enough scale, even though different councils within London have different rules about recycling. Somehow we have enough scale in this basically small island off the west coast of Eurasia,
yep.
and the US is saying, oh no, well. So what do you need to convince a state? Do you need to convince a city government? And what do you have to do?
We're working at the federal level right now, and here's what happened in Europe in particular, since we're here in Europe and UK even specifically. There's a legislation. You can't throw away your household electrical items.
Oh, this is
You're not supposed to. Yeah, the WE
right.
legislation,
right.
waste electrical and electronic equipment, or your end-of-life vehicle, ELV legislation. It has to be recycled in a responsible manner. So an infrastructure developed in order to meet the legislation.
Right.
That was the requirement for you to deposit it rather than throw it in the bin. The other thing that happened was an economic driver. So it's not just a legislative driver. So we lack the legislative drivers in the U.S., and I'm not pro-legislation, frankly. I'm very much a free enterprise type of guy, but we don't, just like the carbon tax, and we don't tax pollution accurately. We don't tax
Whereas
waste.
we have landfill taxes here.
Your landfill taxes are going up £8 a year, I think, per ton, and that has made enormous difference. After about 3 years of that landfill tax, I had every recycler in the UK ringing my phone saying, when can we get a plastics plant built in the UK? So that was sort of the final pin.
Right,
it's
right.
And
that's really depressing, isn't it?
Pocketbook,
because that's just the kind of thing that's never going to fly in the US, where
it's going to be a long time.
Yeah.
Landfill's pretty free in the US,
but I mean, you'll get a carbon tax and a higher gasoline tax way before you get this.
But what's interesting, just one last point on that, I think what Europe has found as a whole, and Germany probably because they did it sooner, has really found this. Where this initially started as an environmental protection mechanism, the WEEE, we don't want it ending up in developing countries where they don't really have the proper techniques to protect the workers or to protect the environment. They now see this as an economic vehicle. It's a job creation vehicle. It's a resource conservation vehicle. And that's why they're driving more recycling legislation, not not to protect the environment. The number one driver is let's grab these resources.
Right. And there was a while there during the boom where the containers of stuff coming into, into Long Beach from China were coming in with all the goods from China,
Yep.
and then they were going back again
Yep.
with waste
Yep.
to be recycled. And that market collapsed, as I understand it.
It's come and gone.
So what's the dynamic there, and how's that affected you? Because you have a plant in China, but is that mainly recycling stuff produced within China?
No, that's a good question. Most of our feedstock for our China plant comes from Europe. It's on those backhaul, all the empty containers. So China makes everything that you buy here in Europe, and you send a lot of empty containers back. We fill some of those containers with shredded plastic, and we recycle them in our plant in China. Now, some of it we ship to our plant in Austria. Others of it will ship to our plant here in the UK. But the remainder, and we can't take enough of it. So we still can't take enough of it. I need to build more plants because there's literally mountains of this stuff growing every day. We fill empty containers and ship them to our plant in China and mine it in plastic, mine the plastic in China. Now, one of the advantages of doing that in China is that a lot of our customers, we sell the plastic right back to the computer or electronics manufacturers, and of course, most of them are in China these days, for good or bad. And actually, the majority of electronics are made 45 minutes from our plant. We're very close to Shenzhen in Guangzhou, China, and that's where everything's made. So our customer base, even if we're selling to an Apple or a Hewlett-Packard or a Dell, their manufacturing is taking place in Guangzhou. So that's where we have to supply our material.
Brilliant. So it turns out there is gold in them there are garbage.
There is.
After all,
in
brilliant.
fact, I did a calculation once to show that this plastic waste, I probably shouldn't tell too many people this, and I'll be competing with some of you in the room. The plastic waste is actually more valuable than typical gold ore from a gold mine, just because the concentration is much higher.
Excellent. Mike Biddle, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.